Hello, dear viewers. An envelope lies on the kitchen table. An ordinary envelope, slightly crumpled, with foreign stamps and handwriting that everyone in the family recognizes immediately. The sender's address is written in Latin letters. They ask about the mother's health, describe how the children have started school, and remember an uncle who died after the family had not seen him for many years. At the end are the simplest words. We are alive. We remember. Write to us. But the letter is not read with joy alone. It is read quietly. The kitchen door is closed. The child is told not to mention at school where the envelope came from. The envelope itself is not left lying in plain sight. Before reaching the kitchen, the letter has already passed through the shared entrance hall and the mailbox. A neighbor, a building caretaker, or an acquaintance who happened to be nearby might have noticed the foreign stamps. That did not mean everyone was watching or reporting people, but the family could never know in advance which stranger's glance would remain indifferent and which would remember the address. Sometimes the letter itself brought no danger. What made it dangerous was the country in which even a family connection could look like political guilt. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way, stories that existed for decades only in family memory have a chance to be heard. To understand the fear surrounding such a letter, it is important to begin not with the security services or with famous political trials. We must begin with the family. After the Holocaust of European Jewry, family ties were torn apart by borders, war, evacuation, death, and emigration. Some relatives lived in Moscow, Kiev, Riga, or Tbilisi. Others found themselves in Poland, Romania, or the United States. Some left for Israel after the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948. The Soviet Union initially recognized the new state, but its attitude toward Israel soon became part of the larger politics of the Cold War, and great power politics entered small apartments without knocking, through newspapers, questionnaires, conversations at work, and envelopes delivered through the mail. For a family, an address in Haifa, Tel Aviv, or Jerusalem meant one thing: a loved one lived there. For the system, that same address could mean something else. This citizen maintained regular contact with a foreign country. There was an address on the envelope, but in Soviet reality, an address could sometimes be read as a description of the person receiving it. The Soviet state was generally suspicious of foreign connections. Employment forms, background checks, and special questionnaires included questions about relatives abroad, their occupations, and whether contact with them was maintained. Surviving archival examples reveal the logic behind such investigations. The state was interested not only in the individual, but also in the geography of that individual's family. For employment at restricted facilities, access to classified information, foreign business trips, or positions of responsibility, such information could carry particular importance. This did not concern Jews alone. Relatives in any capitalist country could be regarded as a sign of political unreliability. But for Jews, a family connection with Israel gradually acquired an additional national and political meaning. In June 1967, following the Six-Day War, the Soviet Union severed diplomatic relations with Israel. State propaganda then began to speak with increasing intensity about Zionism as a hostile force. Researchers of Soviet anti-Semitism have noted that this campaign often transferred old anti-Jewish stereotypes into the official language of the struggle against Zionists. As a result, a Jew who simply had a relative in Israel could fear that a private family connection would be interpreted politically. Here it is important to be precise. Not every letter was opened. Not every recipient was summoned for questioning. Not every correspondence led to dismissal from work or rejection from a university. Soviet life differed from city to city, decade to decade, and institution to institution. Sometimes a letter arrived, the family read it and replied, and nothing visibly happened. But people knew something else. The state possessed mechanisms for monitoring correspondence. A research project at the University of Alberta has published secret Soviet documents concerning the inspection of private mail, instructions for censors, and the political monitoring of correspondence. These materials primarily cover earlier periods, but they reveal a long-standing institutional habit of treating a letter not merely as a private object, but also as a source of information. A person could never know whether the words they had written were being read only by their sister in Israel. Uncertainty itself was part of the pressure. Let us imagine not one particular family, but a typical situation assembled from recurring details found in memories of everyday Soviet life. History has not preserved the exact words of this conversation, but the atmosphere is easy to understand. The mother cuts open the envelope with a kitchen knife. The father looks first not at the letter, but at the postmark. The grandmother asks for it to be read aloud, slowly. The letter says that the summer was hot, that the son found a job, and that a stone was placed on the grandfather's grave. Then comes a sentence, "Perhaps one day we will see each other." The room falls silent. Why could those particular words be frightening? Because "we will see each other" meant a journey. A journey meant an application meant a questionnaire, and the questionnaire required the applicant to name relatives abroad. At some point, the families longing to see one another entered the corridors of a government institution, where human grief was translated into the language of permits, official references, and political reliability. The letter reached the apartment, but fear arrived with it. The situation became especially difficult for those who decided to request permission to leave the country. Beginning in the late 1960s and throughout the following decades, many Soviet Jews applied for permission to emigrate to Israel. The procedure required an official summons or invitation from Israel. The very document confirming that relatives were waiting there became part of the applicant's file at the Office of Visas and Registration, commonly known as OVIR. But submitting an application could make a person's intentions known to the state and to the institution where that person worked. Refuseniks, people who were denied permission to leave, could spend years trapped between repeated applications, dismissals, professional isolation, and surveillance. For the family, it was a relationship between relatives. For the system, it was a possible channel of contact. And here, a letter truly could become heavier than paper. Not because it contained evidence of a crime, but because it confirmed the existence of a relationship that the recipient would later have to disclose on an official questionnaire. Concealing a relative was dangerous. Any inconsistency could lead to further questions. Naming the relative meant admitting a connection with a state that Soviet propaganda increasingly portrayed as an ideological enemy. Private life was thus trapped between truth and safety. The letter's next destination was the workplace. Imagine an engineer at a facility involved in classified development. He studied hard, broke no laws, and performed his duties faithfully for many years. But then a relative in Israel appeared in his personnel file. That fact alone was not necessarily a sentence. Yet, when decisions were made about security clearance, promotion, or a foreign assignment, the connection could become an additional obstacle. The decision was often explained not through anti-Semitism or politics, but through vague phrases. It is not considered appropriate. There is no operational necessity. The candidate is unsuitable based on questionnaire information. The system did not always shout. Sometimes it simply refused to sign the document. We have reached the middle of this story. Write in the comments whether you have heard family stories about letters that were hidden, reread in whispers, or considered too dangerous to keep. And support this video with a like. Family testimony helps history remain alive. This form of pressure was especially painful because the person affected could never prove the true reason for the refusal. No one said, "You are not being promoted because of a letter from Israel." They might say nothing at all. But all around the person were questionnaires, personnel departments, official references, conversations with superiors, and well-known examples of people who lost their professional standing after applying to leave the country. The American Jewish Historical Society, in its accounts of the refuseniks, emphasizes that the act of applying itself could have devastating consequences. Museum and educational materials concerning post-war Jewish life also describe dismissals, expulsions from educational institutions, searches, arrests, and prison sentences in the most severe cases. This did not happen to everyone, and it did not happen because of a single letter, but it created an atmosphere in which any contact with Israel was treated with caution. The letter's next destination was the university. A young person could be asked whether they had relatives abroad. Formally, the question did not sound like an accusation, but even without a connection to Israel, Soviet Jews faced unofficial discrimination when applying to certain prestigious universities and departments. A connection with emigration added another layer of suspicion. Would this person eventually leave? Would they gain access to restricted research? Would they transmit information? Were they ideologically unstable? These formulas did not necessarily have to be spoken aloud. That was precisely why family caution was passed on to children without explanation. Don't tell anyone at school that your aunt lives in Israel. Don't take the envelope with you. Don't write about where your father works. It is better not to answer that question at all. And the child learned not only how to read the letter, the child learned how to read the fear on the adults' faces. Some families continued corresponding. Others reduced their letters to safe, neutral phrases. Still others asked relatives not to write about politics, emigration, the military, demonstrations, or Jewish religious life. Sometimes letters were destroyed after being read. Sometimes the pages were separated from the envelope. Sometimes families replied only rarely, so as not to create the impression of regular contact. Those who fell silent should not be condemned. Silence did not always mean indifference. Sometimes it was a way to protect a son applying to university, a husband working at a restricted facility, a daughter who might otherwise be denied a business trip, elderly parents who feared another visit from a man carrying official identification. The price of caution was that the family itself began to sever its own memory. A relative in Israel wrote about the birth of a child. The reply arrived months later. They reported the death of a mother. The letter was read too late. They sent a photograph. It was hidden between the pages of a book. They asked for the Jewish name of a great-grandfather. The reply carefully avoided the question. Not because the name had been forgotten, but because the name might sound too loud. By the 1970s, letters were increasingly becoming part of the larger story of the Soviet Jewish movement for emigration. In 1969, 18 Jewish families from Georgia sent an appeal to the Israeli leadership and international organizations, asking for help in obtaining permission to emigrate. Such letters were no longer private correspondence. They were open political acts. They showed that some Soviet Jews were no longer willing to accept the role of people who were permitted to remember their families only in silence. There was, however, an important boundary between an important political appeal and an ordinary family envelope. Most people were not activists. They were not planning to fight the state. They wanted to know whether a sister had recovered. They wanted to send a photograph of a grandson. They wanted to report that their parents' grave had survived. They wanted confirmation that after war and decades of separation, someone from the family was still alive. That is precisely why the story of the letter matters so much. It shows how a political system could claim the right to interpret human closeness. For a mother, he was her son. For the personnel department, he was a relative abroad. For an elderly man, it was a photograph of his brother. For the propaganda machine, it was a connection with Israel. For a child, she was an aunt he had never seen. For the security services, she was a potential contact. Some people read lines about health and family. Others could see a political message in those same words. That was how paper became heavier than it appeared. Historical accuracy, however, requires us to remember that the danger depended on the period, the profession, the place of employment, the contents of the correspondence, the family's public profile, attempts to emigrate, and the degree of interest shown by the authorities. We must not turn the past into a legend in which every foreign envelope automatically destroyed a life. But neither should we dismiss people's fear simply because punishment did not occur every time. Systems of pressure often work precisely this way. They punish a small number of people visibly enough to make many others cautious. What should be remembered from this story? The State of Israel was established in May 1948, and the Soviet Union initially recognized it. In June 1967, diplomatic relations were severed. Soviet questionnaires really did ask about relatives and connections abroad. Emigration to Israel required official documents, including an invitation, and a refusal could last for years. Most importantly, a letter from Israel was not a crime. But in an atmosphere of state-sponsored anti-Zionism, closed borders and government control, it could become a risk factor. Now, let us return to the envelope lying on the kitchen table. At first, the viewer saw only stamps, unfamiliar letters, and hands carefully unfolding a sheet of paper. Now, much more can be seen inside that envelope. There was a family scattered by war and borders. There was the memory of Jewish origins, something the state permitted people to record in official documents, but did not always allow them to live openly and freely. There was fear of a questionnaire, a personnel department, a closed office door, and a question asked in a voice that sounded far too calm. But there was something else as well, a stubborn refusal to lose one's family. Letters from Israel could ruin a person's life, not because they necessarily contained anything dangerous, but because in the Soviet Union, the very possibility of being connected with Israel could become grounds for suspicion. And then even the simplest words, "We are alive," "We remember," "Write to us," began to sound like a risk. But they kept writing anyway. Because a state can sever diplomatic relations, it can close a border, it can demand a questionnaire, it can force a person to lower their voice. But as long as a letter still reaches the family has not yet disappeared. If you watched this story to the end, write the code word envelope in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who believe Jewish memory must be preserved. Because every name that is preserved, every letter that is read, and every family testimony that survives restores what the system tried to turn into a source of suspicion: the right to remember one another.